Hello, my darlings. Welcome to R.I.P. with Linzi, where we slip into the rooms the past forgot and listen for the breath that's still inside the walls. I'm your host, Linzi Legron. Tonight, we drift to Villiscila, Iowa, June 1912, where 8 souls were taken by an unseen hand in a quiet house that still hums with whispers. Faces of the victims covered, mirrors shrouded, and the family axe that never left. As always, this haunting is brought to life by my marvelous producers at Chicken Wrap Productions. And if you love what we're building here together, please press all the buttons, every button. Subscribe, like, leave a comment, send it to a friend, someone else who loves the dark. Now, this case, the Villiscila axe murders, has a great many victims and nearly as many suspects. So dim the lights, draw the curtains, and listen. Villiscila is waiting. Get ready to rest in peace. All right, let's start by setting the scene. It's Villiscila, Iowa, June 9th, 1912, and this is a tiny Midwestern town, about 2,500 people. So I'm trying to paint the picture for you. Very small town. Everyone kind of knows everyone. You know, there's porches with people on them sipping their tea and watching the grass grow, basically. There's not a ton to do in a town that size. But on Sunday night, June 9th, 1912, the Moore family, Josiah and Sarah, with their children Herman, 11 years old, Catherine, 10 years old, Boyd, 7 years old, and Paul, 5 years old, were attending an event called Children's Day at the Presbyterian Church. And their 2 friends, Lena, who was 12, and Ina Stillinger, who was 8, they were invited for a slumber party. So it was so sweet. It was just kind of a really ordinary, beautiful, balmy summer day. They went to this sweet children's program during the day, and then they walk home, they undress, they go to sleep, and the house takes a breath in that it will never release. So the discovery. June 10th, 1912, the next morning, a neighbor notices the house is sort of oddly still for the time of day it was. The curtains are still drawn, calls to the home are going unanswered. The scene that follows becomes absolute myth in Villiscila. The door to the home opens and the air is all wrong. And in the first bedroom, the parents' bedroom, shadows begin to gather around the truth. People spill in and out before the crime scene can actually be secured and contained. And the investigation will start in this fog of contamination. So they are already up against a resource shortage and also a lack of experience dealing with this type of a crime scene. And then you add to that the fact that all of these interested, curious, horrified, frightened onlookers are spilling in and out of this home, touching everything. You can imagine the situation that the police were in nearly immediately with this murder that was already so baffling in nature. Who could want this entire family dead? And I haven't even told you about the viciousness of the attack. So let's get into the murders next. Okay, we're going to start by doing kind of a forensic walkthrough of the home as the police and the community would have found it. So we're going to begin with Josiah and Sarah's room, the parents' bedroom. And the killer, almost certainly with Josiah's own axe, basically just struck repeatedly as the couple slept. There was a kerosene lamp or a lantern that was set on the floor with the chimney removed and the wick turned all the way down, just enough light to be able to see, but not enough light to truly be seen. Certainly not from the street. So that was an interesting clue. The faces of all of the victims were covered, and there was blood cast high onto the ceiling, which would suggest that the blows from the axe were forceful, violent, vicious, hysterical in a way. In addition, and in Josiah's case, the blows fell with particular fury, and his eyes were absolutely obliterated. The axe blade was even used on him. In the children's room were the 4 more children, and they were all murdered as they slept. Each child's face was covered by sheets or clothing, and the violence of this act is maybe softened by the fabric, but only to the eye. Their autopsies and the depth and ferocity of the blows to these children's heads and bodies tell a story all their own. And then in the downstairs guest room is where the Stillinger girls were staying, and Ina appears to have died in her sleep. However, Lena shows some defensive marks, showing signs that she was awake. And there are accounts of strange positioning and the suggestion of potential sexual staging, though hard evidence is really contested on this matter in particular. On the kitchen table, there's also a plate of food that has been left uneaten and a bowl of bloody water, speculated to have been used to wash the killer's hands. And then upstairs in the attic, there is another clue. Investigators would later note cigarette butts up there, suggesting that someone waited above the family until they fell asleep. Additionally, throughout the home, windows were covered with garments or cloth, mirrors were shrouded. It was as though the killer wanted to wrap the house in a blindness all its own. And then there's the tempo of the killings. The pattern suggests a killer moving from room to room with chilling calm, just deliberate intent. Parents first, children's next, and then the guests. Between rooms, the murderer covers faces, turns down lamps, and basically closes the house off from the rest of the world. Now let's take a look at the evidence. The removed chimney and trimmed wick of the small little lantern left in the parents' bedroom would indicate that this killer was trying to control visibility. He didn't want to be seen, he or she didn't want to be seen from the street, and wanted just enough light not to stumble through the house and wake someone up. Again, we've talked about the cigarettes in the attic. Someone likely waited for the family to arrive, listening to them as they settled in, undressing, settling down for the night, and then falling asleep. And that is one of the most chilling aspects of this case, because it is just so horrifying to imagine someone in your home waiting for you to get there to murder you. So again, we talked about the covered faces and mirrors, that this is a ritual of concealment, of shame, of piety sometimes, or even, maybe some type of twisted habit by a serial killer. But in essence, forensic psychologists state that this helps the killer to sort of erase the grisly task they've just carried out. And one more thing about the uneaten meal set out, it was just set there next to the bowl of bloody water. And again, this would suggest that the killer made himself or herself something to eat, sat down at their kitchen table in a house full of dead bodies, sat down next to a bowl of water, washed their mitts, and then began eating a meal. And then when they were through, just stood up and evidently left. I'll tell you what they didn't bring when they left, though, is the axe. It was not carried in either. It was confirmed to be the family's axe taken from the home and then abandoned, as though the tool was only a means to an end. And the house itself was the deadly and disgusting signature. And then the last bit of evidence that the investigators had were basically a house full of destroyed fingerprints. Townspeople, again horrified and curious, moved through the house long before the scene was secured, and vital prints were definitely smudged away. So that's it. That's everything investigators had in the way of evidence on this particular case. And together these artifacts do tell a story far more terrifying than the blows that a killer left in his victims' heads and faces and bodies. This really told the story of a killer who arranged this murder, not reacting to some sort of outside stimuli. These people were very clearly targeted, and this killer was so comfortable with this act that they seemingly stayed and made themselves a meal after the murders. Okay, next we'll do a deep dive into the victimology, meaning the backstory of each and every one of the victims in this case. As previously discussed, there are 8 of them and 6 of them are children. So we're going to start with the Moores, the parents in this home. Josiah was 43, and he was considered a respected businessman. He ran a hardware and like a farm store, and he was known for industry, for being having some kind of a reserved attitude, a man whose days were basically measured and dependable. At church he was steady, at home he was dad the anchor. Anger toward him, if there was any in town, definitely was coming from other sources than his own family. He was very, very highly regarded and loved in his own family. His wife, Sarah, was 39, and she was warm and deeply engaged with church and all the children's programs. And in fact, on the night of the murders, she had helped shepherd this beautiful event, Children's Day, at their local church. And so it means that her last hours were spent, singing hymns to the kids and serving lemonade and having just a beautiful, sweet summer afternoon/evening, nothing to report. And then there are the Moore children. And first is Herman, and he is 11, considered kind of responsible, protective. He's kind of on that cusp of being the big kid who does errands without prompting and can kind of look after the smaller ones a little bit. And then there's Catherine, who's 10, and she was just bright, helpful, had the kind of a laugh that neighbors remembered and missed after she was murdered. Her younger brother, Boyd, was 7, and he's living his best life in Iowa. He's still kind of mispronouncing words and celebrating small triumphs, doing his best to grow up. And then there was the smallest, 5-year-old Paul. And he's just the littlest guy in the family, still sailing paper boats in puddles and sticky little fingers and asking for bedtime stories. And then one of the most tragic components of this case are the 2 Stillinger sisters, Lena, again, who was 12, and her sister, Ina. And the Stillinger sisters were just friends of the family. They didn't even, it's just so heartbreaking to imagine that you say, yes, you can go stay the night at your friend's house, and then both of your children are murdered. I mean, that is just an outrage. Before we jump into the suspects, I want to take a second to talk about the investigation itself. So, without the police there containing the crime scene, and without real standard operating procedures around this is how a crime scene is handled, naturally the investigation was messy from the start. Basically, all sorts of townspeople had come in and taken a look. There were just too many hands, too many fingerprints on everything. The sheriff struggled to control the scene that was basically already compromised, and then, of course, the tips and the rumors started. Someone had seen a strange a man near the depot. There was a drifter seen washing some crimson from his hands in a creek. There was a farmer who maybe knew too much, and a preacher with dark appetites. The case would long be a tangle of politics, pressure, and even pet theories. Witness statements swelled and then also contradicted each other, and leads basically led nowhere. And Villiscila learned that horror can be compounded by the mishandling of truth. So now let's get into the suspects and theories. The first suspect is Reverend George Kelly, and he was the itinerant preacher, basically a kind of a small, nervous man with some troubling behaviors. He'd been in town for Children's Day and left the next morning. Allegedly spoke to someone of the murders before this information was even widely known, and it is reported that he later confessed. However, following his confession, he recanted his statement. Because his confession was fragmented and a little inconsistent, it was considered possibly coerced. And while there were accounts of voyeurism and obscene letters deepening the suspicion, he was tried, actually, for this crime, and a jury did not convict him. Unfortunately, what isn't as closely aligned is the volatility of this nature. There were really no motives that were identified within this particular suspect. And then, of course, the lack of physical evidence and the ultimate acquittal. And even if, well, I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about double jeopardy, because I know that forensic teams have to be really careful about making sure that they have all the available evidence to support a case prior to going to trial, because if you try someone for a crime and then, like in this case, they're found not guilty, you cannot try them again for that crime ever again. I'm sure there's some sort of loophole about new evidence becoming available or something like that. So if you know the answer to this question, definitely hit us up in the comments. Let me know. Educate all of us here at RIP. We'd love it. For now, let's move on to the second suspect, Frank F. Jones, the powerful rival. He was a wealthy Villiscila businessman and politician, and Josiah had left this guy, Jones's store, to basically start his own. So basically learned under this Jones fellow, then took his show on the road and created a rival or competitive company, farm store, basically. And so allegedly this took lucrative accounts away from the original business, Frank Jones's business, and town talk kind of inflated this into a potential motive. The theory extends even to Jones hiring a killer rather than swinging the axe himself. What fits is a possible motive by rivalry, possible deep resentment, and the resources to be able to hire somebody. What fails to fit in this case are that there is no physical linkage, no direct witness, and a motive without mechanics is pretty clunky, certainly as it relates to in a trial setting and convincing a jury of your peers. So suspect number 3 is William Blackie Mansfield, and he was kind of the drifter with a pattern. He was a suspect in some other axe murders, and some investigators believe he committed multiple family slayings across state lines in this era. This guy was suspected of some other murders, and there were just kind of murmurs or rumors about, you know, families being murdered at night and being some parallels in the cases, that they were murdered at night, the blinds were drawn, the faces were covered, it was an axe from the home. All of the towns that were impacted with families who had been slain were kind of near one of the major train lines to make for a swift escape. So what really fits with this suspect is the pattern of his geographic location around the United States at the time of these murders. But really what doesn't fit is that there is no definitive tie to Villiscila, and there's a real lack of hard evidence. Finally, or rather moving on, we also have Henry Lee Moore, and so he was another serial axeman that was convicted of murdering his mother and grandmother with an axe months after Villiscila. And certain detective minds tried to kind of lay a larger tapestry of killings at his feet. You know, once they had this guy for this crime. So what does fit in this case is that the brutality aligns, but the timeline was unfortunately not possible. So he was ruled out as a suspect. So then there was Andy Sawyer, the odd laborer. And he was a railroad worker whose behavior after the murders kind of struck others as strange. He became fearful of his own acts and fascinated by this murder case. His employer actually provided an alibi that seemed solid, but suspicion still flickered and then dimmed, basically. What fits is his proximity to the rails, his kind of erratic behavior. What fails is that he has an alibi, and oddness in behavior is not actual evidence of a crime that's been committed. So then there is the brother-in-law theory. Sam Moyer was Sarah's brother, and he was said to have made direct threats. Though he did have an alibi and was dropped as one of the considerations, sometimes family rage is the first place suspicion rests. And here, unfortunately, it didn't hold water. Number 7 is the attic watcher, or the man from the train, and this is a broader hypothesis that connects Villiscila to a chain of axe murders before and after 1912. Basically, bedtime families, blinds drawn, weapons all coming from in the home, quick vanishing murderers, along with geographic locations that are seemingly strategically placed along railroads for making for a quick exit. And some researchers name a single serial drifter operating by a night train. And Villiscila, in this lens, is just one stop on a longer, colder, more terrifying itinerary. So what fits is cigarettes in the attic, the light management, meaning that this killer was only using enough light to be able to see within the environment but not be seen outside of the environment. The proximity to railroad lines, as we said, the covered faces of the victims, the kitchen wash-up, and basically kind of all fit the spree pattern. What fails with this is that wicked word again: proof, evidence. The story fits too well, perhaps, without that grounding nail. There's just no way to actually tie conclusively. And we forget that during this time in police work, they just did not have a lot of the same tools and tactics that they do today. Okay, let's wrap up with the house today. The Villiscila Axe Murder House stands as a museum. Guests spend the night. This sounds terrifying, by the way. If you have done this, or you know someone who has done this, please put a little note in the comment section. I've got to speak to somebody who's had this experience. I guess guests spend the night, listen for footsteps, record whispers that might be mice or might be some kind of paranormal experience. They even have paranormalists who bring equipment and look for ghosts and hunt for answers. Skeptics bring notebooks. Everyone basically brings a heartbeat that they can hear in their ears in the middle of the night, I'm sure. So what remains is it's not answers, it's not a conviction in this case. And certainly what remains is not proof. We don't have hardly any proof in this. And that's kind of where actual humans come in. Someone somewhere knows something about this murder. And now, because this case is so awfully old, it is likely that the killer's secrets has died with them. But that's not to say that they didn't keep a diary and leave it somewhere, or, you just never can tell where a new lead could come from in a cold case. And so I think it's important to continue talking about these cases and seeking some answers and trying to, get justice for these victims, this Moore family and the 2 darling friends that came over for the slumber party. My darlings, a summer night, a family of 8, and a town that never truly slept again. The Villiscila axe murders are a wound stitched with a rumor and a prayer, and still the threads don't hold. We've left with a lantern on the floor, a house full of covered faces, and a long walk to the depot. If tonight's journey left you breathless, please tell me, subscribe, leave a note or a comment. We'd just love to hear from you. I just want to thank you so much for being here. It's always such a delight to spend time with you, darlings. So until next week, rest in peace.